Look at your own last name for a second. Say it out loud if nobody is around to judge you for it. Whoever gave it to you inherited it from a father, who inherited it from his father, in an unbroken chain most families never think twice about. That chain survived famines, migrations, and diseases that erased entire villages around it. Now consider this. If you could trace every single father-to-father line on the planet back roughly 7,000 years, something happens that should not happen. Almost all of those lines just stop. Not slowly, in the genetic record, across several separate continents, at roughly the same window of time. Only about one father in 20 leaves descendants who are still walking around today. Women's family lines during the same stretch barely thin out at all. Something happened to the men. Something big enough to leave a scar in the DNA of nearly everyone alive right now. Small enough that no history book, no oral tradition, ever wrote it down. The honest question researchers are still fighting over is this. Was that scar left by a war nobody survived to describe, or by something far quieter, and in its own way more unsettling? Most of the internet has already decided what happened. Type this question into a search bar, and you will find dozens of videos confidently declaring a secret ancient war, sometimes called the mankind gap, that wiped out 95% of men in a single catastrophic event. Thumbnails show burning villages and skull piles. It's a clean story, clean villain, clean tragedy, one number that explains everything. It spreads well because it asks nothing difficult of the viewer. It is also not quite what the actual genetic data says. The real study behind this number never described a single global war. It described something stranger and more precise, a collapse in the diversity of paternal lineages, not a body count. Once you understand the mechanism researchers are debating, the story gets more interesting, not less. The truth might not require a single battlefield at all. Let's make this concrete before anything else. Picture a village of 100 men and 100 women, all having children with each other over many generations. Now imagine 5 of those 100 men happen to have unusually large families, more wives, more surviving sons, more grandsons carrying their exact line forward. The other 95 men also have children. Their lines simply thin out faster, generation after generation, purely by chance and circumstance. Many quietly run out of male descendants centuries later. Nobody in that village needs to die violently for this to happen. This is exactly how surnames behave in the real world right now, in towns nobody ever wrote a war story about. Walk through an old cemetery and you will notice the same handful of family names repeating over and over, while dozens of other names from the same era appear exactly once and never again. Nobody murdered those families. Their lines simply did not continue. One farmer had 4 sons who all lived to have sons of their own. His neighbor had 3 sons and lost 2 of them to a bad winter. 3 generations later, one surname fills half the village, and the other exists only on a cracked headstone nobody visits anymore. Here's the strange part. Somebody already solved this puzzle over a century ago, and it had nothing to do with ancient DNA. Back in 1875, a wealthy Englishman named Francis Galton grew concerned that aristocratic surnames kept disappearing generation after generation, even among families with plenty of money and plenty of children. Working with a mathematician named Henry Watson, he built a mathematical model to explain it, now called a branching process. The unsettling conclusion was this: even if every family has, on average, enough sons to replace the father, pure random chance still guarantees that most lines go extinct eventually. A handful of lucky lines simply keep multiplying, while the majority quietly vanish through nobody's fault at all. Galton was worried about titled Victorian gentlemen losing their names. He had no idea the exact same cold math was already written into the DNA of paternal lines 7,000 years older than his oldest client. Geneticists study something almost identical when they look at the Y chromosome. This is the piece of DNA passed strictly from father to son, generation after generation, essentially unchanged, except for rare mutations. Each mutation works like a tiny, reliable clock. Compare the Y chromosomes of thousands of men alive today and count the differences between them. You can reconstruct an entire family tree of the human male line, then estimate how many distinct branches of that tree survived from any point in the past. What geneticist Monica Karmin and her team found, when they did exactly this in 2015, is striking. The number of surviving paternal branches nosedives hard in multiple regions of the world, right around 7,000 years ago. The scale of the drop is what makes this genuinely strange. Karmin's team calculated the effective breeding population, essentially how many men were successfully passing on genes at any given moment. During this window, That number cratered so severely that researchers estimated something close to one man reproducing for every handful of women doing the same. Female genetic diversity across the same period barely moved. Whatever happened, it targeted paternal lines specifically, and it happened on multiple continents that had no contact with each other at the time. The Middle East shows a version of this collapse. So does East Asia, and parts of Africa, though not always at exactly the same moment on the calendar. So where does the war theory actually come from? Not from nowhere. Primatologist Frans de Waal spent years documenting how chimpanzee communities organize coordinated, lethal attacks on males from neighboring groups. These are our closest living relatives. A patrol of adult males moves quietly along a territorial boundary and finds a lone male from a rival group. They kill him methodically, sometimes over the course of many separate raids across several years, until an entire neighboring community simply ceases to exist as an independent group. The females from the defeated group, along with their territory, are absorbed into the attacking community. This is not a rare freak event in chimpanzee societies. Researchers studying multiple wild populations across Africa have documented the same basic pattern independently, in groups that never had any contact with each other. If that same underlying instinct existed in our own species before written history, and there is little evolutionary reason to assume it simply switched off somewhere between chimpanzees and us, the pattern would look exactly like small human bands wiping out rival males while keeping their women. Anthropologist Azar Gat, in his book War in Human Civilization, documented just how common lethal conflict between small-scale societies was throughout prehistory. This was long before anything resembling a modern army or a written treaty existed. The pattern he found again and again was strikingly specific, not random slaughter, but a particular kind of targeted violence aimed at eliminating rival men while leaving the women and children of the defeated side alive. In patrilineal societies, men typically stay in their birth group, while women move between groups through marriage. Conflict between neighboring clans often meant killing the men of a rival group specifically, while absorbing the women into the winning side. Picture two neighboring clans sharing one river valley during a drought year. One clan has more spears, more sons of fighting age, and a harvest that failed slightly less badly than its neighbors. That is often all the difference history needed. If that pattern repeated constantly across thousands of years and thousands of valleys, it would produce exactly the kind of signature Karmin found. Paternal lines wiped out, maternal lines continuing almost undisturbed, just relocated into new communities under a different roof. Consider what that meant for the people living it, not just the statistics left behind centuries later. A young woman from the losing clan wakes up one morning inside her own home, beside her own family, expecting an ordinary day. By the following season, she is raising children inside the winning clan's camp instead. Her sons carry a paternal line that is not her father's, not her brother's, her husband, or anyone she grew up beside. Her own mitochondrial line continues perfectly intact. Everything else about her old life does not. That is what a maternal line surviving while a paternal line vanishes can actually look like at ground level. Stripped of the abstraction of a chart, that is a coherent story. And for years, it was the leading explanation. This is where certainty disappears, though. A clan wiped out by violence, and a clan that simply never produced surviving grandsons look identical in the genetic record decades later. DNA cannot tell you whether a lineage ended because of a spear or because of nothing more dramatic than a run of bad luck across a few generations. Which means the war theory, however plausible, was never something the DNA alone could confirm. In 2018, a team led by Tianchen Zeng tested a different explanation, using computer simulations rather than assumptions. Their model asked a simple question: could ordinary competition between patrilineal clans over land and prestige and resources produce this exact bottleneck without a single act of violence anywhere in the simulation? The answer that came back was yes. Some clans simply outcompeted others generation after generation, growing larger and splitting into new subclans that shared the same paternal line. Other clans stagnated or slowly dissolved instead. If that happened, you get the same collapse in paternal diversity purely through social and economic pressure. Zeng's team called this cultural hitchhiking. Successful clans didn't need to kill anyone. They just needed to keep winning, quietly, for a very long time. The same way one family in that village ended up with 4 surviving sons, while another had none. Notice what this means. The same genetic scar can be explained by mass violence, or by several thousand years of one type of family simply outcompeting another at the dinner table and in the marriage market. Both explanations fit the same evidence equally well. Right now, nobody can prove which one or what mixture of both actually happened. There is one place, though, where the evidence points more directly at violent replacement, and it is not gentle. This next part is the closest thing to a documented case we actually have. Before we go there, it helps to look at something far more recent because it shows exactly how devastating a single successful paternal line can become without any ambiguity at all. In 2003, geneticist Tatiana Zerjal and her colleagues studied Y chromosome samples across a huge stretch of Asia, from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea. They found something almost impossible to believe at first. Roughly 8% of men across that entire region, an estimated 16 million men alive today, carry a nearly identical Y chromosome lineage traced back to a single man who lived around 800 years ago. The timing and geography point directly at the Mongol Empire. Researchers have widely connected the finding to Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. They fathered an extraordinary number of children through conquest, political marriage, and a harem system built directly into the machinery of empire. Sit with that number for a second. 16 million men walking around today, all sharing one great-great-great-grandfather many times over. Not through some ancient mist of prehistory. Through documented conquest, well within the range of written history. Names, dates, and battles all attached to it. The mechanism is not mysterious either. Conquest gave certain men access to dozens or even hundreds of women through political marriage and captured concubines, while defeated rivals lost any chance of fathering children at all. Multiply an ordinary man's handful of children by a factor of 50 or more across a few generations, and the mathematics stops being surprising. It becomes almost inevitable. The Mongol case does not prove the 7,000-year-old bottleneck was violent. It proves that violence, when it succeeds, leaves exactly this kind of fingerprint. That fingerprint is now sitting inside a meaningful fraction of the men reading this sentence. Now back to the older, colder case. Around 4,500 years ago, ancient DNA recovered across Europe shows an enormous, abrupt shift. In 2015, geneticist Wolfgang Hack published a landmark study in the journal Nature. His team compared hundreds of ancient genomes across the continent and found that populations related to Yamnaya herders from the steppe north of the Black Sea appear almost everywhere within a few centuries, carrying Y chromosome lineages that had barely existed on the continent before. The same migration is now widely linked to the spread of the Indo-European languages that eventually gave rise to English, German, and dozens of others still spoken today. Within a few centuries, in some regions, the previous male lineages are almost entirely gone. Mitochondrial lineages from the earlier farming population persist strongly, though, passed down through daughters and granddaughters who stayed exactly where they always had. Geneticist David Reich and his colleagues have argued this pattern is difficult to explain without substantial violence, or at minimum, a level of social domination severe enough to prevent local men from having surviving sons at anything close to the rate incoming men did. Imagine standing in one of those river valleys as a farmer whose family had worked the same soil for 1,000 years. You watch strangers arrive with animals, wagons, and weapons your grandfather's generation had never seen. Within your own son's lifetime, his name might no longer exist anywhere on that land. Not because anyone wrote a single word about what happened there. Because 7,000 years later, someone reading a DNA sample would find his line simply ends, and a stranger's line begins exactly where his stopped. So here is where the picture gets complicated rather than simpler. It is not one war, 7,000 years ago, everywhere at once. Researchers Chiara Bettini and Mark Jobling reviewed the global data. They found multiple separate bottlenecks in different regions, at different times, sometimes centuries apart. A collapse in East Asia does not line up neatly with the collapse in Europe. In parts of Africa, the timing shifts again, closer to the spread of cattle herding and the social structures that came with it. Bettini's own earlier work on African Y chromosomes points to a bottleneck tied to the expansion of Bantu-speaking cattle herding communities. They spread across the continent generation after generation, outbreeding and absorbing the hunter-gatherer groups already living there. Some may reflect violent replacement close to what happened on the Yamnaya steppe. Others may reflect nothing more than a handful of successful families quietly outcompeting their neighbors for a very long stretch of ordinary human history. Zoom out for a moment as far as this story goes. An entire planet, multiple unrelated continents, thousands of separate human communities who had no way of ever hearing about each other. All of them produced a strikingly similar signal in their son's DNA within a loosely overlapping window of a few thousand years. Then zoom back in, all the way down to one single farmer standing in one single field, wondering if his youngest boy will live long enough to have sons of his own. Both scales are true at once. That is what makes this particular mystery so difficult to simplify into a single headline. Think about what that means for a moment. We built an entire viral story around one dramatic global war. What the evidence more likely shows is several different, unrelated collapses. Each has its own local explanation, some violent and some not, that simply happen to rhyme with each other in the genetic record. Here is what any of this actually means for you. Somewhere behind you on your own father's side, there is an unbroken line stretching back through every one of these events. Every collapse, every clan that quietly failed to produce a surviving grandson, every possible war nobody wrote down. Your line made it through all of it, not because your ancestors were stronger or smarter or morally superior to the millions of paternal lines that quietly ended along the way. Sometimes it really is that simple and that unsettling. A father has one more surviving son than the family 2 farms over, and 7,000 years later, an entire branch of humanity has vanished from the record while yours is sitting here reading about it. This is not only an ancient story either. So what does that mean for someone living right now? Scrolling through this on a phone that would have looked like sorcery to every single person in this script. Genealogists studying surname records from the last few centuries find the exact same pattern, playing out on a smaller scale, right now, in living memory. Family names that were common in a village 100 years ago have simply disappeared from the phone book. Not because of any tragedy, because of daughters instead of sons, a house that stayed empty a little too long, or a family that moved to a city and never had children at all. You are watching Galton's branching process happen in your own lifetime. If you know where to look, somewhere in your own extended family, a cousin's line, or an uncle who never had children. A branch of the family tree is quietly doing right now exactly what happened to 95 out of every 100 paternal lines 7,000 years ago. Nobody needs a war for that. It is simply how lines end. The next time you see your own surname written down, on a mailbox or a form you barely glance at, remember what Galton noticed about wealthy Victorian families. Remember what Karmin found written into the DNA of the whole species. Most lines don't make it. Yours did, not because it deserved to. We answered the what. The genetic collapse is real, well documented, and shows up on multiple continents. No single explanation currently accounts for every region equally well, though. The why is still genuinely unresolved. Split between violence we cannot prove and quiet demographic competition we cannot fully rule out either. And the Mongol case shows us both mechanisms can run through the exact same bloodline at once. Maybe the more uncomfortable question isn't what wiped out 95% of ancient paternal lines. Maybe it's why we reach so eagerly for the war story. The quieter explanation, generation after generation of ordinary people simply out-surviving their neighbors, might be the one that actually explains most of human history. Look at your last name, one more time. It survived something. We are still arguing about what. If your own family name just started feeling a little heavier, that's worth a subscribe on its own. We dig into what your DNA is quietly still telling you every week. Cases just as strange as 16 million men sharing one grandfather. The honest version is almost always stranger than the war story. Somewhere behind you, 7,000 years of quiet survival got you to this exact sentence. Most of humanity's fathers did not make it that far.